Felipe says, so which are the three main sectors where codes are urgently needed? That's an interesting question. I'm going to have to think about that and get back to you. Our panelists today might also have some thoughts on that. I did fix the recording for anyone asking about the recording. And just for recording posterity, I did shave my beard, so you're not going crazy. It is not there anymore. It will grow back eventually. I hope everyone had a good time with the homework. I went through the homework and it seems like most people had a fairly easy time. So that's great. And that's a good testament to the work that everyone's been putting in, like I was saying yesterday, over the past 13 days, but realistically 4 weeks. So yes, the recording is on. It wasn't on before, but it is now. I know people rely on the recordings. It's funny to think back to before the class started and think that I wasn't even, I was like debating whether or not we were even going to have the recordings. So I'm glad to hear not only that, I'm not only happy that we were able to figure it out, but also glad to see that they're so valuable for people. So we'll keep it going for sure. Okay, it's 5:05. I am going to get started here. We'll let people continue to trickle in, but in the meantime, let's get going. Okay, we are going to promote, and I'm going to do a quick introduction here. So today we have with us Brian Douglas. He's on Twitter as bdougio, and Brian is a friend of mine and also a coworker at GitHub, where he is a staff developer advocate. So for those of you that don't know what a developer advocate is, a developer advocate does a lot of things. So for the first thing is that we have other apps that need to be able to integrate with GitHub. So Brian spends time going out of his way to make sure that all those apps that want to integrate with GitHub can do it easily. And then kind of the second part that isn't a part of a lot of developer advocates' role, but is a part of Brian's role, is the part where you talk about how do you use GitHub. So he's not only a developer advocate, also developer kind of relations, I guess I would say. Also, just in general, is a tremendous support to people getting started in tech. And he does that in a couple of ways. So one is he just talks about it a lot. Another is that he leads virtual screencasts. I know that I've been trying to get onto Twitch, but Brian's like actually successfully on Twitch and like regularly doing it. And also is kind of a prolific podcaster. So has a ton to support with or to share with us today. Has a neon pizza sign behind him. And I'm going to let Brian spend some time introducing himself. And as he goes through his introduction, if you have questions, just drop them down in the Q&A and we'll get to as many as we can. And thank you for being here. Also, because of COVID, haven't seen you in about a year, but it's good to see you.
Yeah. It's I used to run into you at least once a quarter in the office, or maybe twice a year. I'm not sure what the frequency was, and
just like random conferences too, right?
Yeah. Well, I was just with someone brought up RailsConf recently. So GitHub, we use Rails internally. I'm not sure if that came up in conversation, but the fact that RailsConf is having remote this year and didn't happen last year, that was the last time I saw a lot of my coworkers was at RailsConf in Minneapolis. So pretty nostalgic. But everybody, I'm bdougio. That's my name here on Zoom. You probably see it down here, maybe it's further along. Depends on how wide your screen is. But I am, as John said, I am a developer advocate at GitHub. I've been doing it for 3 years as of a month ago. It's been a quick 3 years. I joined right before the Microsoft acquisition. So if anybody follows the news or tech news, I was right before that time, had a baby. So then I took 5 months off and then came back and we were a Microsoft owned company. So it was quite a whirlwind. But I did have some slides, which I'll share my screen. Actually, John, could you enable screen share?
Yes, let me figure out how to do that.
Yeah, it's funny because I give this. It's always like developer relations, which is that's the team I'm on. I'm a developer advocate, and I always have the talks ready to go. So when John asked me to do this, I'm like, oh yeah, I can do this. I've got time, and again, just want to say I'm happy to do this. I'm happy that you're doing this as well. But I wanted to talk real quick about my path in open source, and that sort of also encompasses my introduction to programming as well. And GitHub built using open source technologies, the home for open source, the home for developers. I personally think open source is an awesome opportunity for anybody who's learning how to do code to leverage those tools. Use solve problems to advance your career or the future of your career, and never forget that. If you wanted to hear like the full story of how I got into programming, I mentioned I just had a kid 2 years ago, but my first kid is how I got into programming originally. The full story is here at github.com/readme/Brian Douglas. I had a son who was born 11 weeks early. And at the time I was doing sales, IT sales. And I have a finance degree. So I got a finance degree in 2008, no finance jobs. So I took a sales job to do technical stuff and did that for about almost 4 years. Got promoted twice in 1 year. So I went from senior sales to IT consultant, which means that you're kind of like it's kind of like staff engineering, but it's not really the same. It just means you just know the stuff you're selling really well. So I had my 26 weeks is insane. Sorry, I have the chat open, so please ask questions. I'll pay attention to that. But yeah, I mean, it was a life experience that kind of changed everything. And because as you know, with 26 weeks, even micro preemies, you have to be in the hospital, the NICU. They have to make sure they can develop the baby and they can sustain life without the need of at least their lungs need to be capacitated, like to be able to hold air and stuff like that. But basically what I'm getting at is I was stuck in the hospital. We were traveling back and forth. I had an idea for an app. I considered myself a religious person. And at the time, it was such a traumatic experience that my wife and I were like, we should probably just go to church and like get something positive. So we were attending a church, but we decided that we didn't want to go to the church that was 25 miles away from the hospital. We had to go to something closer. So I had the idea for an app to build basically we found the church, but it was hard to Google church in Tampa. I'm from Tampa, Florida. And it was like almost an impossible task to do, to find out if the church was crazy, if the church wasn't crazy. Does the church have music? Does the church have prayer? Like all churches are different. Everybody, it's like programming. There's not a direct path to a higher power. So like, choose your own adventure. That's not the point of this conversation, but I walked away at that experience of like, hey, there should be like an app where I could just search church in like these parameters and give me the church that fits in like what I'm looking for. And that didn't exist at the time. There are other people who have built this since, but no one's really done it great. So if you want an idea, like there you go, that's your first app. So I built this thing while in the hospital and sort of sitting around. And I built it really because I found when I got back out of the hospital and was back to my sales job that you're only as good as your last month in sales because you're all based on sales cycles and stuff like that. And I just wanted something different. And I was super proud of the thing I built. It was very awful, but like I learned how to code while sitting in a hospital waiting for my son to get bigger. So I say that because during that time, I didn't mention this in that story, but the story you just saw, but 6 months prior, I actually tried to do Android development. Tried to teach myself. I've always been sort of like around the computer, always been a really good copy and paster. SourceForge is like how I used to do a bunch of like hacking games and stuff like that. So I kind of understood code and how to like get a job done, but I didn't know how to like actually engineer. So in order to keep myself accountable, I started a blog on Blogspot, and this is the actual URL. And this is it. This is the last post I made in 2015 in May, mainly because I built a new blog from scratch called briandouglas.me. But I bring this up because every time I learned something new, I'd write a blog post about it. And I would always go back and like, because what happens is you'll forget. And if you learn something or you overcome some weird git rebasing or merging conflicts and stuff like that, write a blog post on how you discovered how to solve that problem. And that would be how I keep myself accountable. And I did that for a long time, to the point where the entire 6-7 months that it took me to learn how to code and build a project, I ended up getting a job as well because I ran into somebody at a meetup who was like, hey, we're hiring. Doesn't matter how junior you are, like we'll teach you, just like take the job. And I was like, okay, I'll take the job. So I quit sales, took a programming job in Orlando, Florida, doing Ruby on Rails. And then my career is just kind of been up since then. And like, I don't want to say that as like to encourage you that everything's gonna be great. It's gonna be easy no matter what. That was never the case. It just sort of like, I just happened to be in the right place at the right time and met the right people. So like, one, share your story, at least to yourself, like open up a email yourself notes of how you learned how to solve a problem. GitHub gist, open up a repo, put a bunch of markdown files. You don't have to do a blog. You just have to write it down. And I think hopefully that's a takeaway you can sort of take from this. And then two, do stuff like this. Get involved in communities. There are tons of communities like Code Newbie that you can engage with and find other people learning. And that was the other thing that I did. I joined the Code Newbie community, and that sort of also helped propel myself in the career that I have today. So I wanted to talk about open source real quick. I had no idea how to use GitHub. I did the bare minimum to get an app running, but I didn't know how to use issues. I didn't know how to do pull requests. I didn't know how to do any GitHub feature. I just kind of out of luck in a lot of different ways. And the company I worked for, I ended up getting a junior developer role at a company in Orlando, and they taught me the bare basics, but we didn't even use GitHub that well. So what I'm getting at is I had this idea for another app, and I partnered with some people from the Code Newbie community to build it. And the only issue I had was that the only solutions I could find of how to build WebSocket servers and those connections to do like chat application stuff was through Node.js. It's a server-side JavaScript language, or it's server-side JavaScript being the language, but it's a flavor of JavaScript being on the server. At the time, it was super new, and I had no idea how to even use it. So I found a project that solved the problem on GitHub for me. And instead of opening an issue, which I highly recommend opening up an issue on the repo, I couldn't do that. So I could do it. I just didn't know how to do it. I ended up emailing the maintainer of the project directly. And to my surprise, he responded back to my email, to the point where he responded back to my email at 2 a.m. in the morning. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. And then I would ask him a question. He'd respond back. I'm like, wow, this guy really cares about his project that has 0 stars and that I'm using. And he ended up telling me that it was a project he built one-off for the company called Vercel. The founder of Vercel, he just built a thing for them. And then Vercel actually ended up using it for their whole platform and stuff like that. At the time, they were called Zeit, and it was like a very small, like two-person operation. But what I'm getting at is he took the time to respond to me. And a lot of times it's just about those getting people who are happy to respond and answer your questions. And that's what I love about open source is this, if you just are willing to learn, there are people who are willing to answer your questions. And I was trying to be very polite the entire time. And he was overly polite to the point where he actually apologized on being slow to respond. And he sent me a picture because at the time, I didn't get this, he was a digital nomad and he was actually in Thailand at a K-pop concert. So that's the picture that we're looking at right now. And he's like, yeah, sorry, I'm glad you figured it out. But, you know, I was at a K-pop concert. If you have any more questions, definitely hit me up during the week. And I ended up not hitting him up because he solved the problem for me. He went back and taught me how to do server-side JavaScript. Yeah, I did not know what a digital nomad was then. And I'm super appreciative that that person was super willing to kind of level me up. And I've been doing JavaScript since that one moment too, as well. I've kind of leveraged JavaScript in addition to my Ruby knowledge to help level me up and learn stuff I didn't learn building my church app, which was like how to do web performance, how to do networking, how to like get stuff hosted on actual platforms like Heroku. So what I just wanted the one takeaway, and hopefully in this sort of brief introduction to who I am, and hopefully you have questions as well. I just want to say open source is valuable to your career. And there's a lot of free mentorship out there. I know you're getting some mentorship through this right here, but just by participating in the open source community, asking questions, joining Discords, it's a great way to sort of get yourself leveled up. It's funny because I was actually chatting with I've been mentoring this one person who was doing Lambda School being the online bootcamp program. That person actually dropped out of Lambda School because he got a job before he completed. And the way he did it is he actually approached this project called Redwood.js. So if you learn Ruby on Rails, Redwood.js is like Rails, but with React. The guy who's creating it is actually the guy who created GitHub, Tom Preston Werner. He's one of the 3, or technically 4 of the maintainers. And like that's a big a big person to have mentoring you into open source. And that's what he did. He just went into the Redwood community. He said, hey, I tried doing this with this. Like, how come I can't do it? And they're like, oh, it's because we haven't done documentation. So he's like, okay, I'll write your documentation. And that's what he did. He wrote documentation. He created example projects. And while he was doing example projects and doing documentation with the example projects, he was then getting his stuff. Like, he wasn't presenting, everybody was presenting his stuff for him. And then it got to the point where he's like, oh, I can do a conference talk because everything's remote. So he started submitting the conference talks. He started going on podcasts. And he's just like every other week he was doing something remotely while also being in Lambda school. Also while driving Uber. That was his day job, was driving Uber during the pandemic, which like we're still in at the moment. So what I'm getting at is that there's a lot of opportunity out there. It's just the opportunity to put yourself out there. This is what I look like on the internet. If you want to reach out to me, I am an advocate for GitHub. I'm happy to take questions. I also joke that I'm a Beyonce advocate because I love doing stuff like this. I don't know if John, how much you know how much I love doing stuff like this, but that's why it was so easy for me to say yes. I'll briefly mention GitHub Actions as a word and a phrase because that's what I talk about. So I'm obligated to mention that. Don't look into it until you're ready. But I do have a YouTube channel where I talk about a lot of early stage developer introduction to my story. So don't mind the GitHub Action videos that I have on the screenshot. I didn't have time to replace it. I do have some sort of like how I got my job at GitHub. There's a whole story behind that. I have a lot of other stories on how I ended up transitioning from full-time developer to DevRel as well. And I do have a whole basketball analogy, but I think I'll pause there and check to see if anybody has any questions, comments, rebuttals. I'm happy to take all of the above.
I love the thumbnails. You do such a good job, like with the whole thing around, like it's a big part of getting out there and sharing your story.
Yeah, and one thing that about the thumbnails and my avatar that I use everywhere, I've been using the avatar since college of what I look like on the internet, and it's really hard for me to change it because I get recognized all the time from the avatar. And so I have a very generic name. My first name's Brian. My last name's Douglas. I have a lot of friends who are Brians in California. Like, it's hard to my first dev job, I was one of 5 Brians on a team. So to the point where when we hired the last Brian on the engineering team, we called him Bri5 because there was 5 of us. So at that point, I started using my GitHub handle, which is bdougie, in all professional situations because there's always going to be another Brian, but there's always going to be one Dougie. So that's why I lead with that. And it's just being memorable, like having a story, like, why are you here? Like, why are you learning how to code? Just kind of have that story ready to go, because if you have a good story, people will Dougie as in Twin Peaks. I guess they predate me, but I guess I was around during Twin Peaks. But anyway, what I'm getting at is I always had a story. I had a memorable face on the internet, and it's kind of helped be consistent with what I've been putting out there and people being connected with me.
When I worked at Tumblr, I was an API engineer, which meant I worked on the API, Tumblr's API. But that position was like kind of a half split between being an API engineer and being a developer advocate for Tumblr. So I would spend a lot of time going to conferences and hackathons as a representative of Tumblr. And one thing that I always thought was really interesting is that while I thought I was going there to teach them how to use the Tumblr API, what actually happened in reality is I spent a lot of time just teaching them how to code or teaching them how to work with some other API. So I love everything that you're doing. And someday I want to be on the podcast too, or sorry, on the Twitch stream.
Yeah, I would love to have you on.
Find my way.
You can show us some stuff, a thing or two. I do Twitch stream every Friday called Open Source Friday. And we bring, it's funny because I've been doing this thing the entire 2020 since March. And we've just been inviting open source maintainers and sharing their secret sauce. That's kind of like what my focus is really, there's a Gucci Mane quote, which I think I've shared with you before, which is, if you're lost in the sauce, actually it was on Tumblr where the quote became popular. If you don't got sauce, then you lost. And it was basically about like how to get to the point where you're like the level of Gucci Mane, where you're the quote unquote godfather of trap music. And what I found was like with open source maintainers, it's the same thing. It's like they figure out the sauce and they figure out how to sort of spread that sauce or keep it to themselves. It's either or. And my whole thing was I always spent time, and it's funny because I have slides on this too as well. Well, I'll briefly talk about the sauce. But yeah, there's this like my whole focus is like the path to open source. It's a bit broken. Like there are people who know how to play the game and how to sort of achieve greatness. And there's the quote there. So I built this project called Open Sauced, and it was really a project for me to learn the GitHub API really well. At the time, it was GraphQL. Just write that term if you aren't familiar with what that is. But I built this tool to basically create a dashboard to manage my open source contributions. And I built this also to grow community for people who also want to learn open source. So if you're interested, if you're down the road and you're like, hey, I finally want to do this open source thing and contribute, just remember the sauce, open sauce, and I'm happy to have you in the community. There's a Discord and we do streams as well on that channel as well.
I love everything you're doing. Also, like every resource that BW has mentioned is going to be linked in the email that I'll send out after the class. But just want to say again, like one, thank you for being here, and two, thank you for everything you do for the developer community as a whole. And I think we have some questions. Normally the way it goes is you're going to start to answer these questions, and then it's just going to be like way too many questions. So
yeah,
if you have some time, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I've got a good 20 minutes.
Sweet, that's perfect. So they're available in the Q&A function here, which I think you have access to. If you want, I can read them to you. Here we are. Otherwise, you can just choose whichever ones you like.
I just found it. So there's a question from Ernest, what was your major challenge in teaching yourself how to program? You made it sound so easy. Yes, it's easy to make it sound easy when I'm on the other end of it. I want to tell you, there were a lot of like frustration. Like I didn't think I could cut it. Like a lot of those moments, a lot of sort of imposter syndrome, a lot of like spending a lot of time in Stack Overflow and just being like, I'm gonna like the story I share about the K-pop concert guy. That was a point of frustration that I got to, where I was like, I said I was going to build this project. I need to build this. It was a Friday night. I'm like, I gotta figure it out tonight, Friday night. Spent all night trying to figure it out. I'm like, oh, I'm so frustrated. I'll do it again Saturday. And mind you, I had a young kid too as well. So he was born. He was only a couple months old. So I was taking care of him, but then also staying up all night trying to work on this problem. And then it was like Saturday, and it was like, okay, I can't get this. Like, I don't think I'm cut out to even build this project, even though I can build stuff for work. So like I was frustrated to the point where I went to github.com, found their project, found the person who wrote all the code, went to their profile, saw their email, clicked on the email, and I'm like, hey, I'm a new developer trying to build this problem. Here's what I tried. Here's what's not working. Like, do you have any thoughts, or like, like, is there something I'm missing? And then like they responded back pretty quickly, and they responded basically at the time Node.js went through a split where the community created two different versions of Node.js. One was IO.js and the other one was Node.js. And the way you operated the next level functionality and features, which he was using, you had to add a Harmony flag, which again, if you're just starting, it probably is all confusing. It's just basically, I just want to summarize, there was some extra sauce that I was not aware of because it wasn't documented. It was all in Stack Overflow. It was in GitHub issues, which I didn't know how to use. So this guy emailed me back and I was like, wow, this is amazing. I know how to use Node.js. I went and did a bunch of Node.js courses after that, like the next couple of weeks, and got leveled up. But like, I didn't know what I didn't know. And until you get to that point where you don't know what you don't know, you got to start asking questions, and you got to be okay with like the failure. And like one thing I say, if you're going to sit down and write code, like at least give yourself 2 hours, because you're going to spend 1 hour trying to figure out what you did yesterday. And then you're going to spend 1 hour trying to figure out how to do it, do your next thing. So if you don't time box yourself, like if you only have 30 minutes, like I don't want to say don't bother, like definitely like read some documents or read some code or like study. But if you're going to actually write code, like try to sit 2 hours together to actually work on this problem, because it is going to be a lot of like figuring out stuff, not writing code, reading for an hour, and then writing code and seeing what works and what's broken and all this other stuff. So that was a long-winded answer for just the one answer. So you can tell how this is going to be going. What webcam are you using? Clearest Zoom cam I've seen. Well, I'm cheating. I'm using a Canon EOS M200. Um, on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/bdougie, I do have a video where I go through my entire setup. So if you do want to know exactly how I set this up and how this works, like this is my job. I sort of, during 2020, I leveled up my Zoom game. I made it cool at GitHub to use green screens before they were cool. And then once that got big, I actually started leveling up my actual setup with an actual camera and a mixer. And like, honestly, like I'm doing a little too much. But if you're interested, definitely check that out. Looks like someone, oh, Paul, I remember you. We met back in Ruby, the day at the Ruby on Rails meetup, NVIDIA Labs. Yeah, so wow, small world. Paul, what is up? You didn't hit me up on Twitter. Let's say hi. Let's have a Zoom call. Yeah, so part of my story is my son was born early. I went back to work. I learned how to code. And by the time I got back to work, I was learning how to code at work because I was at the point where I was doing my job in like a couple hours. I'd answer all emails. I'd do all my code calling because I was doing sales. And then by lunchtime, I would just write code and I would just do it on the job because I was just like, I'm done with this job. No one cares about me. Like my son almost like was born, still born. We pulled through that. And like, I was just kind of like, I'm 100% done. The day I learned that I decided to do Ruby on Rails, I was searching like, how can I build this app quickly? And I discovered Ruby on Rails like one morning while I was feeding my son. And then my entire day, I didn't do any work. All I did was research Ruby on Rails. And then I found out about meetups. Meetup.com was pretty new at that point. And then I was like, oh, Ruby on Rails meetups, Ruby meetup. There's a Ruby meetup in Orlando. And at the time I lived in Tampa. So Tampa to Orlando is it's about an hour and a half away, but with traffic, it's about 5 hours away. So that's what I got. I got 5 hours. I left work at 2:00 in the afternoon. I'm like, I called my wife and said, hey, I found this thing. I don't explain it, but it's a Ruby meetup. People who learn how to code, they're going to have a meetup tonight. And the day I found out about Ruby on Rails, like literally, actually the day I found about Ruby at all, that I had found a meetup that night. It's like, I can't come home. I've got to go to Orlando. And she's like, okay. Like, let me know. Call me when you're on your way home. Let me know when you get there safe. Cause like it's a journey because it's traffic. So I sat in the traffic. I ended up getting there at the second talk. So it's like 3 talks. I missed the first talk because I left at 2:00. The meetup started at 6:00. So like, or 6:30. Anyway, insanity. Went there, saw the last talk, didn't understand anything the person was saying. It was actually it was at Code School, NVIDIA Labs Code School, which is Code School is now Pluralsight, got purchased by Pluralsight. So anyway, at that meetup, I met 2 guys that worked at the company called Isaiah, who were based in Orlando, who were doing Ruby on Rails. And at that conversation, when I met them, it was like, I met everybody. I was like, I'm going to do my sales thing. I'm going to meet everybody. I'm Brian. I just learned how to code today. Like literally, I was like having a conversation like, oh, when did you learn how to start learning how to code? I was like, well, technically today, because I'd only just learned about Ruby today. And they're like, oh, that's cool. And they're like, yeah, we're hiring. And I was like, yeah, but I'm trying to get a engineering job. I don't want to do sales anymore. It's like, okay, well, if you don't want to do sales, let us know when you learn how to code. 6 months later, I met them at Ancient City Ruby. The same 2 guys sat right behind them at Ancient City Ruby, the conference. They turned around and they recognized me because I was like, I'm one of those people that I'm introvert. It doesn't sound like it, but I'm super introverted, like in public situations if I don't want to be on. So like I was just kind of doing my thing, just like, experiencing the conference. They turned around and saw me. I was just going to walk away. But they saw me and they're like, hey, how's the Ruby thing going for you? I was like, yeah, I built an app and I pulled it out on my phone. I was like, here it is. It's kind of like mobile responsive or whatever. Like I tried doing that stuff. And they're like, oh, cool. Like, do you want to interview for a job now? I was like, I don't know if I'm good enough. Like that was my response. And they're like, they looked at me and they said, well, why don't we let us decide that? You should still interview. And if they didn't say that, I would have walked away and be like, that was a cool chance encounter. Totally declined that interview opportunity. And if it wasn't for them saying you should interview anyway and let us decide if you're good enough, I would not have had that job. And I interviewed, I aced the interview. Turns out I knew what I was talking about because I was spending a lot of nights and evenings learning how to code, and got that job. And like pretty much that's my story. So hopefully that was inspiring. That was kind of rambly.
I think it's
But
great.
yeah.
I think a lot of people build up like what they think they need in order to maybe get a job in tech. And a lot of times you go full, like way overboard, and not
Yeah.
realize like at what level people actually are hiring.
Yeah. And it's the
Not
thing
to say
about
you
the,
weren't great. I'm sure
no. Yeah. I mean, but sometimes you can get in your head. So like people just even focusing on like my camera, like I don't want people, I do this because I want to have a good experience and present a good experience and have a good camera. Cause you know, I had the extra money, so I spent the money on the camera. But if you want to do code, you don't have to have the best laptop. You don't have to have a great microphone or a great whatever, or have an AWS account. Like what you need is you and a laptop that can open a terminal. And that's pretty much what that's all you need. But for whatever reason, sometimes we get our head and be like, now we got to we need to, you know, have the latest and greatest or whatever, or have a M1 Mac. Like you don't need an M1 Mac. What you need is like, actually I told my brother, I taught, he was learning how to code. I told him, go to Craigslist. By the way, this is my son who was born 11 weeks early. He's now 7 years old. Okay. He's telling me that my wife wants me to come downstairs. So I can answer one more question, but anyway, don't worry about stuff. Just start today. All right. So how do you even get an open source? I don't even know how to find projects that might interest me. Yes, that is a problem. And it's a problem trying to solve open source. I am actually building an open source tool built on Redwood.js to recommend open source projects for you to contribute to. So you tell me your interest, the algorithm will then tell you a project to contribute to. It's kind of what I did with the church thing. I basically, it's Yelp for churches. I'm trying to build Yelp for open source. So based on knowledge of existing members in the community, you'll have a better start to your open source journey. At the very least, you should just DM me and I could tell you exactly what needs to get shipped. So let me know what language you're looking for. I talk to a lot of open source maintainers. I talk to them every Friday. So like there's a project that's building an open source WYSIWYG editor in React. Those are all tools that you probably don't know, but what they need is documentation help. So if you can just run the script to get this running on your machine and report back on how it works for you, that is valid feedback that not a lot of people are giving. And a lot of open source projects just needs people to use their stuff and tell you if it works. And that's what I did for this guy in Thailand as well. So I will work on learning how to use issues in GitHub. Lab.github.com is a good one. Participate open source, so you read every piece of the code. No, do not read every piece of the code. I would start with talking to the person who wrote the code. Because if you read every piece of the code, it'll put you down a rabbit hole. But if you talk to the person who wrote the code, they'll tell you exactly what to look at first. So it's code doesn't have to only be code focused. It could be people focused. It could be communication focused. And advice to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, try to be a junior front-end developer. Knowledge of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, I would say specialize. Like don't be a generalist, specialize in performance, or specialize in animation, or specialize in CSS, or specialize in JavaScript frameworks. Like if you try to do everything as a junior, like you can get a job, but if you specialize in one thing, it'll probably be much faster trajectory. All right. He wants me to leave. My wife is probably looking at the door, waiting for me to walk down.
Okay. Thank you again for joining us. And hopefully I'll see you in person soon. And we'll be sure to share all of your details via the email, like I said, so people will be reaching out.
All right, excellent. Well, thanks again, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay, hopefully everyone enjoyed our time with Brian. Brian is an awesome person to know. So he's super helpful. Obviously has a lot of context and interest in the types of problems and types of questions that y'all have. So if you are interested in what he was saying and learning more about it and watching him stream on Twitch and listening to his podcasts or hearing what he has to say about junior developers, all things that are relevant to you, then make sure to click the link in the email that I send after the class. He is bdougieyo on Twitter and pretty much everywhere else, including on GitHub. Okay. So let's get started. we're going to start with the homework from yesterday. We're going to go over that, and then we're going to launch into a bunch of new stuff, kind of like we always do. First, I wanted to take a little bit of time, and I wanted to show, I know that there are a lot of people that are having trouble organizing the code inside of their repository. So I wanted to show you briefly how you can create another Rails application inside of your repository, if that's something that you're interested in. So yes, they are. So let me share my screen, and we'll get started. Okay. And don't get excited. Yes, there is going to be another exercise. Okay, so let me get my chat up here so that I don't miss things that you say. Let me get my Q&A so that I don't miss the questions. Okay, so if you want to be able to create multiple apps like I've created here, where I have archive 13 and 12, then what you have to do is you have to type Rails new and type the name of the app that you want to create. So I'm going to create an app called 14. And what that's going to do is it's going to go find, it's going to go install Rails in a new folder, a subfolder inside of your repository. So if you see over here, now I have a new directory called 14. Okay. And once I have that new directory 14, it's going to go install Rails, get everything set up. This is a good time to kind of spend some time closing all of the files that you have open, because they're not going to be the right files for your new repository, and you don't want to confuse things. And I'm going to show you kind of one important step that has to happen at the end in order for everything to work correctly. So give me just a second here, and we'll do that. Felipe says, Sewell, apparently he sees all of your questions all the time. So maybe you're configuring something a particular way. Okay, so now our app is installed here. And now check out this. If I go to the code tab where I would normally push code to GitHub, it says that there's no changes. And the reason that it says that there's no changes is actually that what we've done is we've created another app inside of the existing folder, and it actually has its own, if I do git status here, it actually has its own git set up. So it's like one Git repository sitting inside of another Git repository. The reason that happens is when you create a new Rails app, it automatically sets up Git for the folder. So the way that we can just fix that is we can do rm-rf.git. Make sure you're doing that inside the subfolder, because if you do it in the root directory, then you're going to mess things up, and you're going to have to kind of recreate your code space. So now when I do that, see, all of a sudden it knows that I'm back on main. And I guess if I somehow, how will I do it? Go back and I type git status now it knows that there's a directory that needs to be added here. And I'm guessing that once this catches up, maybe click refresh, you'll see all of these new files, which are inside of that 14 directory. Then I will just add them, commit, and I will say, new app or whatever. And then once I do that, I can push. So hopefully that shows you how you can create a new app inside of the app. Now, the last wrinkle of the whole thing is that, of course, when you want to interact with it, you have to change into that directory. So to change, we use a thing called CD, which means change directory. So we CD into 14, and now we can do everything the same way that we did before, with just Rails C and Rails S and all of those various things. Hey, it looks like I'm having that problem that other people are having. So it's going to be fun. Someone was asking how to reproduce it. And I guess it's pretty easy to reproduce. Okay. The cursed triangle. What a weird way for it to tell you that there's a problem, right? just a triangle. Okay, so we're going to start like we always do. Oh, there's the semicolon 2 R's. Pretty unclear what's happening here. Cool. So everyone that was talking about this earlier, here it is. We're doing it. Let's see if we can start a server without any problems. And I did, they know about that problem, so they should be looking into it. We set up a new app and we have to redo this config host setup. So I'm just going to go into config, into application. You're going to put it, I'm actually in the wrong folder. So I'm going to go into the 14 folder, config, application. And remember, I just put that line there. So now if I refresh, got to restart the server. So we'll close the server, restart the server. And when we start and connect to the right port, now we're on Rails. Okay, so the exercise says to implement a new route in the home controller with a basic HTML view. So I think everyone should know how to do this at this point. Basically, we're going to open a terminal and we're going to run Rails G controller home. That's going to create a home controller. In order to get things in place, we need two things. We need to change to the routes file, which we will do by going to config/routes.rb. And in here, we will create a route. We will create just a get route, which you remember looks like this. So we can say get /John. The controller will be the home controller, and the action will be John. So this could be anything. This could be other. This could be anything you want to. I'll also switch to the double quotes because I realize that it might confuse people a little bit if I use the single quotes. Okay, so I do that. And now if I go to /John, we're going to see an error, and it says the action John could not be found in home controller. And yep, that makes sense. So let's go to our home controller and let's add an action called John. Now let's refresh again, and this time it's going to say home controller John is missing a template. So that just means that we have to go into our views directory, into the home directory, and create a new file called john.html.erb. Is this all feeling like a natural thing for most people at this point? We've created a lot of routes, so this should feel pretty normal. Okay, so let's just write hello world in there for now. That's also going to give us a chance to do this pp equal disable to get that stupid thing to go away. Okay, and now we've got a view that's able to render something that we put into the HTML view. Okay, next thing. Now we're going to add a series of divs to the page with red backgrounds. So we can do that, right? We'll just do a div and we'll write hello. And then we'll take that div and we'll copy it a few times. So we'll just do that and we will refresh. And now we're supposed to have red backgrounds. So what I could do is I could just make all divs have red backgrounds. But that seems like it's going to maybe be a problem in case I want to add more things to the page. So what I'm going to do instead is to all of these, I'm going to add class equals box. Then I will go over to my style sheets, into the home style sheet, and we'll be able to add some styles for all of the places where the class is box by using .box. And inside of here, we'll just write background red. So now if I refresh, we will see that they're all red. Now they're also like really close to each other. So let's figure out how to space them out a little bit. In order to space them out, I'm going to just do margin 10 pixels, which is going to put space around the outside of the boxes, thus spacing them away from each other. Okay. If I wanted to make them look a little nicer, I could do padding 10 pixels. I could do border radius 10 pixels. Let's see what that looks like. Maybe it looks a little bit nicer. Okay, cool. So now they have rounded corners and a little bit of space inside. And maybe we even want to make the color of the text inside white instead of black. So yeah, here's our divs now. Okay. Exercise 2 is that we want to change the boxes to blue on page load with JavaScript. So when we read that, we know that we're going to need a JavaScript setup. So let's go into the JavaScript folder, go to the application pack, and we have to hook in a new file. So I'm going to hook in a file, using require .. and then the name of the file that I want to create. In this case, I'm going to create a file called home. We'll create that inside of the JavaScript folder as just home.js. JS is the extension for JavaScript files. And just to make sure it's working, what I will do is I'll put console.log hello. So then if it's working correctly, if I open the inspector, we should see on the right-hand side the word hello. And that will indicate to us that the JavaScript is working and everything's wired up and knows what it's doing together. And that's exactly what we see. We see the word hello on the right-hand side. Ernest, I won't talk too much about that. That you should be able to Google the details about the difference between require and import. But for the purposes of this class, we'll just be using require. You can also use import. Just look up the details if you're interested. Okay, so our task is, just to remind ourselves what the task is, to change the boxes to blue on page load. And the tip here is to use query selector all and a loop. So the first thing is the on page load part. So how do we do something on page load? What we'll do is we'll implement a function and we'll call it something like on page load. And then we will use document add event listener, turbo links load, and we'll pass it a reference to the function on page load. Okay. And for now, again, let's just put in there. Let's put in a console.log again, and we'll refresh. And I can see on the right-hand side that it says loaded, which means that not only are we loading JavaScript, but that our call to document add event listener for turbo links load is successfully calling the on page load method, or sorry, function when the page loads. Now, think just like to call out a little bit about the process that I'm following here. You probably see me doing this over and over again, and it's on purpose. The idea of the process is to validate that I can do one thing at a time. So rather than open the routes file, add a route, make a view, make a style sheet, make JavaScript, and then try to run it all at once and hope that it works. What I'm doing is I'm testing all of my assumptions as I go. So what I'm saying is, okay, I know that in order to do this, I need to be able to react to when the page loads. So let me just get that piece. Let me just do something when the page loads. And if I can do that, then that part of the problem is handled. I don't have to think about that anymore. Now I've solved that part and I can move on to the next part, which is in this case, how do I turn the boxes blue? So that's how you have to think when you're programming, when you're thinking about a large problem, is how can I break it down into a series of small problems that I can independently validate that I can do correctly. If you try to write a bunch of code at once, it's not going to work. And then you're just going to confuse yourself. So, okay, we got to do something in here. What we're going to do is we need to be able to get a handle on all of the boxes. So we'll do let boxes, and then we need to write something here that will give us all the boxes. We learned yesterday about a thing called query selector all. To query selector all, we're going to pass what is called a selector, which is basically the same kind of thing that we would type inside of our CSS file. So in our CSS file, we wrote .box. I'm literally just going to copy that and bring it over into our JavaScript file, where I'm going to put .box in there. And if I actually, instead of writing console.log loaded, I write console.log boxes, what's that going to do? It's all part of the process. It's going to give me the ability to verify that I'm successfully able to get an array of all the boxes. So let's run it and see what happens. Okay, so you can see that what comes back to me is a node list, which is like an array. And if I hover over these individual items in here, you'll see that I actually have handles to the 3 elements on the page. Okay, so this is just the browser trying to help me. And it's tying together what's physically on the page with what I have actually a handle to in the console.log. So this is a good way to validate that I've got this part of the process. Now that I have this part of the process, I need a way to turn the boxes blue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to implement a function, and it's going to be called turn box blue. It's going to take in the element. And in here, I'm just going to write console.log turn box blue, and then element. The idea is that rather than try to figure out how to turn the box blue, all I'm going to worry about is, can I do something, in this case, call the method turn box blue for each of my elements. So I'll take my console.log and I will erase it, and I will replace it with what? Does anyone know? For each, exactly. Isaiah, got it. Like, everyone's getting it. We're on. So turn box blue, and all I do is I call for each, and instead of passing it something like a block in Ruby, I pass it the name of a function. In this case, the function is called turn box blue. So let's refresh the page and see what happens. And now what we're expecting is we're expecting 3 separate log statements on the right-hand side, and that is exactly what we see. So we see the statement turn box blue, which is just the string that we put. And then when I hover over these divs, I'm seeing them highlight the boxes, which means that I've got the next part of the problem, which is I know I needed to do something for all of the boxes. And now I have the ability to, I have a function that gets run for every one of the boxes. So now all I have to do is figure out how to turn the box blue. Let's go up in here. The functions are kind of isolating a certain piece of logic so that I don't have to care about anything except what that function does. That's the power of functions. So how do we turn a box blue? Well, if I have the element, I can call element.style.background color, and I can just say that that's blue. So let's refresh. And they all turn blue. And it's pretty cool because, like, they're not blue because the markup says they're blue. They're blue because JavaScript turned them blue on page load. So you can almost imagine in your head that for a very, very tiny period of time, these boxes were red, and then JavaScript inside of the browser ran and turned them all blue. Okay. So what the way our code works is that our code runs up here before anything happens in what's called the head of the page. And it says, okay, tell me when the page is loaded. Then it puts all of this stuff on the page, including the red boxes. And then at the end, it's like, okay, the page is loaded. And it calls that function that says on when page ready or whatever we called it. And that's the thing that goes back and turns all of the boxes blue. Okay. Now exercise 3 is to add JavaScript to change the colors of the boxes to pink when they get clicked. So we want to be able to click individual one of these and have them turn pink when they get clicked. Okay, so we're going to add another event listener. In this case, we're adding document.add event listener click. And we are going to have to pass that to a method. In this case, we'll call the method turn box pink, or maybe we'll call it box clicked. Okay, and we'll have to implement that function box clicked. Remember, click event callbacks, which is what these are called, take in a click event. And let's just do console.log clicked, and we'll also output the click event. And that's going to let us see kind of what's happening on the page. So let's play around a little bit here. Okay, so now if I go click them, you will see on the right-hand side that it's saying clicked, and that it comes, the click event is output, and it actually contains some different pieces of information. We can expand this and we'll see all the information that this event does contain. So it contains things like, where on the page were you in an X and Y coordinate when you clicked? what was the shift key held down when you were clicking. All of those pieces of information are in here, but the most important thing that's in here is the target property. And the reason that it is important to us is because it holds a reference to the actual element. So the way that we'll get the element from the click handler is we'll call click event.target. So let's try to do that. We're going to create a let. We're going to say clicked element is click event.target. So now in our console.log, instead of outputting the click event, let's just output the clicked element to make sure that it's the actual one that we were hoping to see. So I'm going to refresh the page and I'm going to click them. And now what you see is when I click one and I hover over, it actually highlights the box that I clicked. So I click this one, it highlights the box. So all we have to do now is we have to take the clicked element and change its style background color to pink. Okay, let's run that code. I'm going to refresh the page. And when I refresh the page, now when I click them, they turn pink. Now, one kind of annoying thing is if I click the background, it turns pink too. And that's not what we intended. So we have to go fix that. The way we're going to fix it is inside of here. We're only going to do the change to the color if the clicked element tag name equals div. So we just do an if statement. And now when I refresh the page one last time, I can click these, they turn pink. And if I click the background, it doesn't do anything. So that's exactly everything you need to do for session 13. Okay, I'm going to spend some time answering questions now. So if you have any questions about this, or you want to see me do something to make it a little bit different, feel free to drop them. I'll spend a little bit of time doing this, but we do have a lot of other stuff to cover. So, okay. Anonymous attendee says, I don't get why you need to pass the element, why you don't need to pass the element to the turnbox blue function. Okay, see how turnbox blue gets the element? And then you see how in for each, we're passing a method to turnbox blue. So the way that it works is that there's a method called for each. And inside of for each, it goes through each of the elements. And for each one, it calls the method turnbox blue with a single one of the elements. So imagine if I wanted to show you how to implement for each. It's a method that you call that takes in the name of another method. Okay, and then it essentially inside of itself has let I equals 0, and then it has while I is less than array.length, I plus equals 1, and then it calls method to call of array of I. Okay, so this is like how for each actually works, is it's just a method that takes the name of another method and then can call it. So the reason that we don't have to pass element to turnbox blue is because the thing that's actually passing element to turnbox blue is the for each method itself. Okay, does this make sense to the person that asked that question? This is to say that for each there's nothing magic about for each. All for each is a loop that's calling a method. And if we look up the documentation for each here, we go to for each, we can actually see that the way that works is that the thing you're passing is a callback, and the callback is expected to be a function to execute on each element. Okay, so for each calls a function, and it calls it with these three. It actually calls it with 3 arguments, even though we're only caring about the first one. So it calls it with the value of the individual thing. Then the second thing that it passes is the index of the thing. And then the last thing it passes is the array that is actually being traversed. So it's just a method. You pass in method to call, and it doesn't need element because for each is actually the thing that is passing the element. I hope that makes sense and doesn't confuse things more. It looks like yes from the person that asked that. Okay, Felipe says, I remember you explained it yesterday, but I think it is essential to this topic. Can you tell us what situations / problems are advisable to use JavaScript when coding? When used, what to use JavaScript on and when? Please tell us what are the 3 main situations where you almost always use JavaScript coding. Yeah, so the first place you want to use JavaScript coding is anything you're doing in the web browser. And the reason that you'll use it there is because it's the only thing you can use there. There are no other languages that run inside the web browser. So if you want to be able to have interactive behavior in the web browser, and you don't want to use some kind of a framework like Hotwire to do that with Ruby, then you'll end up using JavaScript. I could have made my job in this course easier by teaching you Hotwire or teaching you something like that. The problem is, and the reason I didn't do it, is that's not a skill that anyone's hiring for. So if I teach you Hotwire, it might make it easier for you to only have to learn one language, but the kind of flip side of that coin is that you will not be learning something that actually gets you a job. Now, JavaScript, on the other hand, is used at pretty much every web company on the planet. So I hope that helps. And I got, yeah, the 3 main situations. I don't know if there are 3 for me personally, just because I'm of the belief that JavaScript primarily should only be used in the web browser because it's too confusing in other places. And I'm sure there are people that disagree with that. I used to disagree with that. So if you're getting started in JavaScript and you're going to do something like Node.js, which Brian was talking about, don't get discouraged. We don't have to agree that JavaScript is useful on the server side. There are definitely plenty of applications where JavaScript is the primary server-side language. Okay, Rajesh says, we did click event.target.tagname is div, but I can't see tag name in the target directory when I collapse it in the console. I think you're asking, I don't see tag name in the output when I show it in the console. So actually, let's do it real quick so that I can show you that it's there. So if I do console.log element, then we're going to bring back those console.logs that were on the right-hand side here. This is showing the element itself, but imagine instead, so you're not going to see it in here because you can't see the actual element. All you're seeing is this like nice representation. It's hiding the real element from you. So what we can do instead is we can say element.target, or sorry, tag name. And when we do that, let's refresh again and let's see what happens. Div, div, div. So div 3 times. So kind of the answer here is that for elements in particular, Chrome will not always show you all the details of the element. You said, no, that wasn't your question. Then you're going to have to ask it more clearly because I don't understand your question, but I'll be happy to answer it. Yeah, Rob says, don't get overwhelmed by the name callback. All it is the function that's passed to another function. Yes, it is a very confusing idea, though. The idea to handle that you're handing essentially the name of a function to another. Rajesh is typing. Anonymous attendee says all tag names have to be capitalized. No, but when you're working, when you call the tag name method in JavaScript, the answer is always going to come back capitalized. So when we compare and we do a comparison between the thing that we want to check to see if it is and the tag name itself, we have to capitalize ours, because if we don't, then it'll be trying to compare essentially uppercase div to lowercase div, and it's not going to think that those are the same. So the answer is JavaScript always gives back div all capitalized. And because of that, if we're checking inequality to be able to see if the tag name is the same as what we want it to be, then we also have to use all capitals. Felipe says, does JavaScript offer error messages? Yes, they do. Maybe you're just really good at it and haven't seen any errors yet. But when you have an error, let's say, for example, instead of click event, I wrote click ENT, and I refresh the page. We're not seeing it. So let's see why we're not seeing it. Click ENT target. Hold on one second. That's it. Sorry, that's in the box clicked handler. Yep, got to click. Kind of amazed that that's not failing, and it's because I changed it back. Oh my God, I'm all over the place. Okay, let's make the typo. Let's change it back. Then let's click on something. Okay, so you'll see an error over here. It says uncaught reference error, click event is not defined. You might not be seeing errors for a different reason though, which is that if you try to call a property on something that doesn't exist, in Ruby, that would raise an error, but in JavaScript, it doesn't. It just returns undefined. So if you thought Ruby let you do anything, JavaScript truly lets you do anything. You can just call properties that don't exist. And the reason is because what you actually have here is a JavaScript object. JavaScript is very confusing. But if you're interested in reading more about that, just read about JavaScript objects. But basically, the short of it is that the thing that we're calling here, click event on target, is not a method like it is in Ruby. It's just a property. And properties by default are all undefined. Rajesh says, console the event actually, and then see it in the browser. I want to see all the properties on the event. Sure, I can do that. So we're going to do console.log, click event. And if I refresh here, we should be able to click. And when we click, we're going to see the pointer event here. And then down here in target, you can click that. And then if you go way down, we don't see tag name here. Is this what you're asking, why we don't see tag name here? I cannot emphasize enough how much JavaScript is confusing. So the reason you can't see tag name here is because this object is actually, I guess you could say, inheriting from another object, and that is the object that actually has the tag name sitting on it. You may be seeing it here. Okay, here it is. So you just click that ... and you can see the rest of the properties. So it's just Chrome was maybe thought that there was too much stuff there. So does that answer your question, Rajesh? So you see ... you see all of the properties. I thought that it was doing something else, but it turns out it wasn't. So just click the ... and you can see the rest. Erica says, are we allowed to use for loops in JavaScript? I think that there's maybe some conflicting advice about that, but if you're interested in it, go just search for loop in JavaScript versus for each or something, and you'll find an answer. The short answer is it works. It works just fine. Rajesh has more questions. Yeah, you can type them now, although we need to get to the new material, so I might stop answering questions just for a little bit because we have an entire lesson still to do. Sewell says, has a question about tests. I'll cover tests a little bit before the end of the course. The short answer is, of course, I write tests, but I will show you how to do it just briefly so that you can start to look at it. Rajesh says, please explain. I observed that when I click on the links, the page doesn't get reloaded. Instead, the blue progress bar sort of appears. Yep. If you look at the previous session when I was talking about turbolinks, that is turbolinks that is being there. The page is not getting reloaded. Turbolinks is doing some kind of a replace. That's exactly right. And the blue progress bar is a div that is supplied by Rails. It should not get applied. You should not be seeing that when you click though. So I'm wondering if maybe you have some kind of a link set up. You can send me your code afterward and I will do everything that I can to help you. And Manon, I'll talk about it a different day. Look at RSpec or mini test. Okay. Phew. Got it. Okay. So today we're going to talk more about JavaScript. I'm going to show you a couple more things in Rails, and we are going to be looking at a little bit more confusing JavaScript, which is going to be great. But we're not going to go too far with it. So the first thing that I want to introduce you to is a thing called closure. So we've been writing a lot of things like this. We've been writing maybe a method called box clicked, and then we've been passing the method that we created to a function. Now, if you look at the code, you'll see that box clicked is only used in one place. So we define a function called box clicked, and then we pass that function as an argument to add event listener. Now, JavaScript actually has a shorter way to write this. And what we can actually do is we can take box clicked, we can move it down below, and then we can, instead of passing box clicked, we can just pass the function. Okay, so now instead of defining box clicked, I've just passed a function, and that function is still called box clicked. I'll show you a couple of things. So let's take away the box clicked part, and let's go refresh the page to see if it still works. Okay, you'll see that it works exactly the same way. Okay, so what I've done is I've taken my box clicked definition, and instead of having a separate thing called box clicked and then passing it to this function, I've just put it directly in line here. So I've passed, instead of the name of a function, I've passed just a function. Okay. And now you're probably looking at this and you're saying, well, now the word box clicked is only in one place. So why do we even need to pass box clicked? And the answer is that you don't. Okay, so now I can write it like this, where I just write function, and then it takes in an argument called click event, and then curly braces. Does this make sense to people? I've inlined the function. I've put the function, instead of saying I'm going to define a function and then I'm going to tell you the name of the function, I just passed the function directly. So let's refresh the page again, and let's make sure that it still works. So we refresh again, and yeah, it still works. And because we do this so often in JavaScript, you can actually write it slightly differently, which we're going to do now. I'm going to remove function, and I'm going to write it like this. So when you're writing, anyone that's ever been confused about these types of functions before, when you're writing open paren and then a name and then equals greater than, what you're really doing is you're creating a function. Andre says, so first we learn how to write functions and now we unlearn how to write functions. I mean, I guess a little bit, but the important thing is that now you understand what's actually happening here when we do something like this, click event equals greater than and curly brace. What we're doing is we're creating a function and then immediately passing it as the second argument to add event listener. You're still going to have to create functions. So you're still going to need to know how to create functions, but it's super important that you know why this syntax works and what it's doing, because you're going to see it everywhere and you need to know when you do something with it, why it's doing what it's doing. Okay, so just as an exercise, let's do the same thing again. Turnbox blue is only called from inside the for each. So we can take turnbox blue, we can go to where that method is included, and we can actually just pass the function instead. We can write it like this. So the first thing is we put the function right in there. The second thing is we can actually remove some of the white space to make it look a little bit smaller. Then we don't need the name anymore. And then once we're here, we can actually remove the word function and instead write just equals greater than there. Okay. And if you prefer to write this way, please go ahead. It's okay. With time, you're going to find that you want to write it like this because that's how everyone writes it. And there are some subtle differences. It just looks better this way. So now I've done that, I can actually go remove my turn box blue method entirely. So someone asks, Andre says, when you do equals greater than, what does it mean? All it means is here are the arguments that the function takes in, and then here's the definition of the function. So all it means is I want to take these arguments in, and I want to call this block with those. It's just the syntax for how to create a function here, how to create what's called an anonymous function. Okay, so if I refresh the page now, just to make sure that it still works. And yep, it does. And then the last one, let's do one more. We're going to take the on-page load method. I'm going to put it bloop just right in there. When I do that, I can remove on-page load. And now I don't need the name on-page load anymore, so I will delete it. And then I don't need the word function here anymore, so I will delete it. And then I have to put equals greater than. And now I've taken all that code and I've condensed it into two things. One is an event handler of things that happen when the page loads, which is namely that we set the color to blue. And then one that happens when you click an element, which is that we determine which element you click, check if it's a div, and if so, turn it to pink. That's it. Page is so simple. So do it again, and here we are. Anonymous attendee says, can you make it go back to the color that it was before if you click it twice? Sure. You can, inside of here, you could just write something like if clicked element dot style dot background color is pink, then turn it to blue. Otherwise, turn it to pink. And then you'll have the thing you want. So we could even just do that real quick. So we'll go bloop, 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 bloop. I think this will work. Let's refresh. Yes, code, 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 code. Okay, now we are getting to somewhere, which is we are going to do, we're going to do something that we haven't done before, but is the most important thing that we have to do in order to tie together everything that we've learned. And what that is we're going to make a call from JavaScript to the Rails app. So we need to connect the two together. We need to be able to make a call from JavaScript to Rails. Yeah, everyone, right before you push, code, 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 code. Okay. So here's what we want to do. We're going to learn a new thing, and that thing is called fetch. Okay. So I'm going to show you how it looks. The way it looks is you call fetch, and fetch takes in a URL of something that you want to get. Okay, so in this case, we need to get something. What we will get is the, what should we get? I think I had something here. Hold on one second. Okay, I'm going to put in this URL, which we'll talk about more in just a second. And then what I want you to do is you're going to call the then method on fetch. Now, what then takes in, yeah, the make fetch happen is like the classic fetch joke. So then is going to take in a function. That function is the what to do with the response function. So we'll call it handle response. So we're going to call a method called handle response. So now we will create a function called handle response. It takes in a response. And this is going to be a little bit confusing, but what it will do is it will do response.text.then. And what that will do, the response.text method, maybe if we click into it, we can, maybe it'll tell us what it'll do in our browser here. Hold on. So it takes a response stream and it reads it the whole way through. So what it's going to do is it's going to read the rest of the information that is coming in. So in this case, we're going to call response.text. It's a method you call to be able to get the text of a response. So you imagine we're making a request to some server somewhere for the URL, which is this URL, and then we want to get the text out of it. So we're going to call the text method. And with that method, then you have to call .then, and you'll pass it another function. In this case, it'll be handle text. Okay, and then we're going to implement handle text, which is going to get the text of the information that is contained at this URL. And what I will do is just console.log text. And let's refresh and see what happens. Okay, cool. So this text here is actually the information that is at that URL. And let's just prove that real quick. Let's take the URL. Let's open it in a browser and look, this is what comes back, this text. So this text looks a little weird, and we're going to get into that in a little bit. But for now, just there's some text that comes back. It looks like this. And we're going to figure out in a second what this is and how to actually work with it. Okay, so before we do that, I want to go through a quick exercise, which is, again, we've created a handle response method that calls a handle response function. So remember, we can take that function block and we can grab it. Now people that know JavaScript are probably understanding why I'm doing the thing that I'm doing, why I'm walking you through how to create a function and then how to use this fat arrow syntax. So let's drop it in there. Okay. And remember, we can do that. So now we can delete the handle response method. We can delete the name. We can delete the word function, and we can replace it with equals greater than after. Okay. Now we can do the same for handle text. We can put handle text into here. So if you're ever confused about what a method, why it's working the way it is, this is what I want you to mentally do. This exercise that I'm doing right now. Write it out with functions and then replace them. So I can remove the name of the function, handle text. I can remove the word function. And I can go like that. So now the reason that I did all of this, the reason that we're so roundabout to get you to here, someone joked that taught you functions just to unteach you functions. If I taught you this, it's very, very confusing to read. There's a lot of parentheses. There's a lot of names. There's a lot of weird symbols. It's only through learning the functions and then learning how they actually fit into this syntax that we can actually deconstruct it and understand it. So remember, this very confusing looking thing is the same thing as the drawn out version that I had before. So remember, it looked like this. This is easy. The other one's hard, but the other one is the one that you will see everywhere. Okay, I'm gonna be explaining fetch again in a second. I want to make sure everyone understands the closure syntax that I'm using. Does everyone understand how I'm getting to that final syntax? I can drop that right in there. I can remove the name. I can replace the word function with an equals greater than after. Then I can do the same thing again. I can grab this, put it in here. I can remove the name. Then I can remove function, and I can replace it with an equals greater than here. That's how I get to this very confusing but very short syntax. So it's a fetch call, then calls a method called then, which is just how fetch works, that takes a function, that then calls a method called text, which then calls a function called then, which then takes another function as an argument. So fetch, the API is a little bit confusing, but hopefully we'll be clear by the end of the session here. Okay. I am going to do a little bit of answering questions before we keep going. Okay. Manon says, can you explain fetch again? Yes. So fetch is a method in JavaScript that takes a URL to fetch. In this case, it's a URL at jsonplaceholder.typicode.com, and then is able to give you back what is contained at that URL. So if I actually go back to my browser and I'm going to go to a new tab that we haven't seen yet called the Networks tab, and I'm going to click all here, and I'm going to refresh the page. Now look what happens. So this is all the things that get loaded when I load the page. The first thing is the page itself. The second thing, I can drag this out a little bit. The second thing is the style sheet. The next thing is our JavaScript. Then look, it says fetch. So what's actually happening is the next thing here, the one, is actually the call that JavaScript is making inside of the user's browser over to jsonplaceholder.typicode.com. And the last thing is the favicon, which is the little icon that shows up here in the browser. So what's actually happening is that the fetch is triggering a request from inside of this web page to another place on the internet called jsonplaceholder.typicode.com. Okay, so just to explain quickly the entire fetch line, we pass the URL, and then we call the then method, which takes a function as its argument, and that function gets the response that is received when calling that URL. Our Raisa says, why can't we just use one then and then do all the actions that we want? Yeah, it's a little confusing, but fetch's API, the way that fetch, sorry, not API, the way that fetch works is that you need two thens. You need one then to get the response, and then you need a second then to get the text out of the response. So it's just how it works. So if you look up documentation for fetch, actually on the official documentation for fetch, the way that it says how fetch works, let me just bring that up real quick. Even on the Typicode, so it looks something like this. It's a fetch call to a URL, and then a call to then, and then another call to then. So there's got to be two calls to then. Felipe says, does the word fetch mean something like div means division? Yes, the word fetch means fetch, which is like you throw a bone for a dog and then the dog goes and fetches it. It basically just means get in English, go get this thing. So it's a fetch the URL, go get the URL, get the information about the URL. If you have an uncaught in promise type error that says failed to fetch, guessing that something is wrong, probably your URL is wrong or something like that. So that's what I would look at first. Manon says, so if I wanted to populate my page with content that I get from API calls, I would use fetch. And that is definitely right. And that is exactly what we're about to do. So if you want to be able to get information into your page that wasn't there when the page loaded, fetch is what you need to do that. It's the only way that you can call back to the server. At least it's the only way we'll learn that you can call back to the server and get a piece of information after the page is already loaded. Okay, so let's do it. Let's make a let's make a piece of our Rails app that returns some information that then we can use inside of JavaScript. So for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to our routes file, and I'm going to implement an endpoint that's get to /time. It'll be in the home controller. The action I will call time. Now, just a regular route, right? If I go to my time, I can implement the time action. And this time, instead of doing HTML, I'm going to do render plain. And I'm going to say the time is time.now. Okay, so let's check that to make sure that it works real quick. We'll just go to /time. Okay. And look what it says. It says the time is time.now. Okay. So that's a simple endpoint. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my JavaScript. And if I can find it. I lost it. Okay, here it is. I'm going to replace this URL that we had in here temporarily with /time, which is basically saying go to this page's /time. Okay, now let's refresh it and look at the console over here on the right-hand side. We'll go back over to the console and look what it says. It says the time is, and it has the information that we generated in the Rails app. So now we, via fetch, have been able to pass information from the Rails app over to the JavaScript app, right? Because we're writing essentially two applications. We're writing the Ruby and Rails app that is the server side, and we're writing the JavaScript app that is the client side. Fetch let us pass information between them. Okay. So let's do something with this because it's pretty boring as is. It just puts it into the console. Let's make a change. So instead of fetch like this, let's actually wrap this into a function, and we'll call that function update time. The way that the function is going to work is it's going to get called. It's going to fetch the time. And then instead of just logging the thing out, what we'll do is we will say get the div using document query selector of .box. So this will get us the first box on the page. And then the div's inner text, set it to the text. Okay, so if we refresh the page, maybe we'll expect that the first box will turn to something else, but it doesn't. Does anyone know why it doesn't? Yep, it never changes because we never called update time. So what we'll do is we'll make a call to update time. And you know the perfect place to call update time is inside of the turbo links load method. So let's do that. And let's refresh again. So we've made JavaScript that waits for the page to load and then makes a call back to the server to get the current time. And then it takes the value that it got from the server, which is just a string, and it puts it onto the page. Okay. Now we do that on page load. Why not go into our click event handler and we'll just call it from there too. Now let's refresh the page. You see how every time I click, it is waiting a second and then it's updating to the most recent time. And if I actually open up the network tab, you can see what's happening here. You can see all these calls to time. Every time I click, it's going to make a new call to time. And then it takes a second because the server takes a second to respond. And then as soon as the information comes back, it updates the text inside the box. So we are making a call to the server every time that the box gets clicked. Okay, anonymous attendee says this can be called scraping, right? This is not scraping. Scraping is when you go to some other site and try to like read the information as if you were a human, but you are a computer. Felipe says, still don't get the difference between a function and a method. Sorry, it is perfectly fine. Just use them interchangeably. It's really, if someone wants to argue about the difference between function and method, then you probably don't want to be their friend anyway. Okay, Rajesh says, if we click on hello world, that would change as well, right? Yep, it will. So if I click any of these, they're all going to do the same thing. They're all going to update the time of the first box. And the reason that they're updating the time of the first box and not the box that's clicked is, of course, because our update time method always selects the first box. So if we wanted to change that and make a minor change, let's remove update time from the load. And let's make it so that update time actually takes in an element to update. And then instead of grabbing the first div on the page, we will use element to update here. And then all we have to do is go up here to where we're calling update time. And what we're going to do, we're going to pass the clicked element into the update time. So now if I refresh again, we'll see that the time won't update. And then when I click one, it'll actually update it right then. Does anyone think this is cool? Is this making sense to everyone? How we're getting data from one to the other and why it matters? We're going to see in a second why you would want to do this, because right now we're just passing the time back, but we can do so many more interesting things than that. But the start is to get it connected together. Paul Senior says, is this called Ajax? And the answer is yes, this is what people refer to as Ajax. There's like a technical wrinkle there, which is that it's technically not Ajax, but not going to get into that. But yes, this is when people talk about Ajax, this is exactly the thing they're talking about. This is Ajax. Ajax stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Don't worry about that. Just call it Ajax, and that's what it is. Okay. Anonymous attendee says, I'm confused with what we put in TurboLink's event listener and what we keep outside. So the TurboLink's event listener is all the things that happen after the page is loaded. This is just a method. And then this one is all the things that happen whenever something is clicked. Rajesh says, if we fetch from an endpoint, then it would display everything on that page, links as well, boxes, forms. No, it would not. And the reason that it won't is because we're using inner text. Inner text is a property in JavaScript, which I can show you really quickly. Inner text is represents the rendered text content of a node. So basically what inner text does is it sets only the text. It won't set rich HTML. So there's no, if you're thinking there's maybe a security problem here, there is not. Ravina says, what does the response argument in braces mean? Are you talking about this one, Ravina? Yeah, so what this means is, remember, you can read it like this. We're passing a function which takes in an argument called response, and we're passing that function to fetch.then. So the jump that I want you to make from, instead of writing function like this, is to remove the word function and then go after the parenthesis and put an equals greater than. And I want you to think of those as the same thing. So before, when we were writing a function that was something like let, and we want to, define a function that says when response is received. And we want to have a function like this. The way that we used to do it is we would write it like this, and we would pass that as an argument when response is received. So the way that we get from where we used to be, which is this, to where we are now, is we basically take the function and we can just drop it right in there. So you can put it in place so you can actually pass a function directly rather than passing it just by name. That allows us to remove the old definition of the function. And now, because we've done that, we don't actually have to have a name anymore. So I'm going to get rid of the name. And then we're just one more step away, which is instead of writing the word function, we can put equals greater than, which is called the fat arrow, which basically denotes that this thing is a function that takes in one argument called the response and has this body. So I hope that clears it up. And if it's confusing, it's because it is confusing. Closures are very confusing. If we fetch from an endpoint, then it would display everything on. Oh, I already answered that. Manon says, what if the API returns an array to us? We'll talk about that in a second. Rajesh says, no, I meant if those things, links, boxes, etc., would come in the response, or if it's just the JSON text, it only is the text that comes in the response. Okay. Rubina, at the end of the class, if you're still not getting how we got to that function, let's walk back through. It also might be helpful to watch the session again, because I did, I think, a longer explanation before without fetch about kind of how I got to the place where the equals greater than existed. But in the context of fetch, it's just how fetch works. There's a call to a method called then that takes in a function, and then it returns an object called the response, or whatever you call it, and then you call text on it. You have to call then again. It's just confusing. That's just how fetch works. So fetch requires two calls to then on two different objects in order to get the thing you want back. Okay, so before, people probably remember when I loaded the page that was for the JSON placeholder.typicode, it came back looking like this. And what this is, you probably can guess from the format, is a structured data. So it looks like a hash in Ruby, right? It's got a key and it's got a value. And this is what we call JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And let me show you how JSON works. If I go into my JavaScript console here, and I want to do JSON.dump, and I can actually pass it some JavaScript objects like key value. What is it? JSON.stringify. Look what it does. It turns a real JavaScript object, which is having maybe a key and a value, and it turns it into this, what we call a serialized form. And JSON is a standardized form. So what's really cool about JSON is that while it is specifically made for JavaScript, Ruby can actually read and write JSON. So what's important about that is that we're able to take some object in JavaScript, which is a JavaScript string. We can actually serialize it, and then we can pass it over to Ruby, and we can deserialize it. And when it pops out on the other end in Ruby, instead of it popping out as a JavaScript object, it pops out as a Ruby object. So then we're able to take a Ruby object on one side, and we can serialize it to JSON. And then when it gets over to JavaScript, we can deserialize it and get JavaScript objects. So it is a very easy way to send, instead of just one thing, which is what we were sending when we were sending the time, you can actually send multiple things together. So this is just the same. Remember when we were sending /time, it's just a string that contains the time. All the JSON is a string that has been put together in a consistent way so that both sides, Rails and JavaScript, can read them. So we put a little curly brace first, and then we put quotes around the key, and then we put a number, then we put a comma. So basically, if Rails and JavaScript can just agree on what it looks like to make a string that contains all of the details about a particular set of properties, then you can actually move data back and forth between them. And that's exactly what JSON is. It's JavaScript object notation. It is a language independent way to pass data back and forth. It looks like a Ruby hash, but actually what this is just a string. And now we're going to see how to create a JSON string on the Ruby side. So let's do it. Let's go to our controller. And what we're going to do is instead of render plain, we're going to write render JSON. And then instead of the time is, we can actually pass a hash. Okay, so then we're going to take our string and we'll put it into the hash. And in the hash, we'll say something like time is time.now. Time.now. Okay. So I'm taking a hash that now contains a single value called time, and I'm going to do render JSON of hash. And let's go check out our time endpoint again and see what it looks like. Check it out. It looks like a curly brace, and then a quote around time, and then another quote around the other properties. So this looks a lot like this because they're both JSON. I hope this is making sense, and if it's not, please just drop some comments below. Okay, so let's go to the page, and let's go to our boxes, and let's click them. Okay, and look what happens. We're getting here is the string, but like nobody wants to see that. People don't want to see the string, the string that is the time like this. Why would anyone want to see that? So what we're going to do instead, and it's actually even redirecting us in a weird way, which I think someone had mentioned that before, but we can look into that. So we can actually change our JavaScript, and we're going to change it so that instead of doing response.text, we're going to do response.json, which is saying, hey, I know that this URL that I'm hitting /time is going to return JSON information. And then because we have control over what we type here, we can just do JSON, or we can call it something else. Let's call it data. Okay. And then what I'm going to do here is instead of messing with the element, what I'll do is just console.log data. Okay, and let's refresh the page. If you click one, you'll see over here the JavaScript that corresponds to the thing that we just did. And there's a little arrow next to it. But what's really weird is that if it's just a string, there shouldn't be an arrow. And the reason that there's an arrow is because it's not just a string, it's actually a full JavaScript object. So now it is an object that has a property called time, and the value is the actual time. So now we're actually passing structured data, meaning data that has properties and your keys and values from Ruby as a hash all the way down to JavaScript. Okay, so what we can do, because it is just a property, is we can do data.time. And if we refresh that, what's going to come out is just the string, which is corresponding to the value of the time property on the data object that came back to us. And then it's really obvious how we have to update the code. It should just be element to update.innerText equals time. And if we want, we can even put a string before it. We can say the time is, and we can interact with that in JavaScript because it's just the string. So if we refresh again, click one. Oh no, I broke it. This should be data.time. Refresh again. And let's click one. And we see the time is, and then just the time component. Okay, so a couple of things that we learned here. We learned how to get data into JavaScript from a web server. We learned about JSON, and we learned about how to send JSON data from the server down to the client. So we can send anything we want down to the client now. It's not just about the time. We can send information about the current user's name. We can send information about the name of the car that the user is currently viewing inside of this action. So we can get data, any kind of data that we want from inside of here, and we can pass it down using render JSON. Okay. Now, I'm going to show you one more thing, which we're going to need in order to do the homework. It's very, very powerful. This is a very powerful idea. Okay, so the last thing that I'm going to show you here is when we did resources, we had resources. Actually, maybe I won't show this now. We'll wait until tomorrow because I think this is maybe too much, too close to the end. Okay, I'm going to answer a couple questions. Ernest says, nice, how about sending the JSON to your app and saving it in a model in the database as an entry? Yes, you can definitely do that. So you can make a call from JavaScript over to your app and you can get the data and you can save it. We might spend some time doing that tomorrow, depending on how quickly things go. Rajesh says, why isn't time like time in def time? Okay, let's see. In def time. So this is a key, which is the key that the property is going to be named by. And then this is the value, which is we're getting the value by calling time.now, which is the now method on the time class, which just gives back an object, which is the current time. You can think of it like this, time.now.2s. So it's just the string representation of the current time. This is how you get the current time in Ruby. Okay. We can pass other things. So if we said like a number and we pass 5, now let's take a look at our time endpoint here. And we can see that now it's got a time property and a number property. So if I go back though, even though I added a new property, this is still going to work the same way because the time property is still called the same thing. Someone is asking me to run a poll to see if people understand the topic, which sure, I can do that. Let's see, how would I do this? Edit. Do you understand the topic? Sure. It says the wrong thing. It says should we cover the homework today? Just answer it as if the thing says, do you understand the topic? Okay, it looks like we're early numbers show about 85% understand the topic. So that feels pretty good. A maybe is fine. Maybe is actually like, I don't know, kind of where I hope you are, you know, like where I hope people are. If you're a solid yes, that makes me think that like you already know exactly what you're doing and you don't need the course. If you're a no, then that's concerning, but I think we can work on it. And if you're a maybe, then that's great. You think you have it, you're still processing, you want to come back and you want to spend more time with it. That sounds right. Sounds right to me. Okay. We're going to cover all this tomorrow. We're not just going to like do it and then never talk about it again. And hopefully you're going to use it on the homework. So you should get used to this. So hope that helps. Anonymous attendee says, so to access objects from the API, we fetch it from the JSON. That is right. That's what I showed you today. Tomorrow, I'll show you how to fetch HTML if you want to do that. Johnny, you can. And Manon says, glad you taught APIs today. I have them in mind for the final project. Yeah, APIs are very, very powerful because without them, your JavaScript page is very limited as to what it can do. Maybe it can only change the color of things or things like that. So ideally what you want instead is you want the ability to be able to work with the page. You want to be able to change things. Someone asks how many attendees today? We had 68, which is the same number we had yesterday. Felipe says, is it possible to smuggle data, not just from JavaScript to Ruby, but for example, from GPS to Ruby or other database? That's outside the context of the course, but if you email me, we can talk about it. Okay, exercise 14. I want you to implement an animal model, which contains the name of an animal. And I want it to also contain the URL of an image of that animal and a word representation of the sound that the animal makes. For example, meow is a cat, woof is a dog, etc. Then in exercise 2, I want you to create a page at /animals that is going to list all of the animals in your database. Bonus points available if you find out how to sort the animals by name. And then for each animal, I want you to show the name of the animal, and I want you to show an image that is in the database of the animal using the image tag helper in Rails, which we showed in a previous one. And then in exercise 3, I want you to make it, and this is where the JavaScript comes in. I want you to make it so that when you click an animal, you'll send the ID of the animal to the server via JavaScript, via like a normal resource route. And then it will respond with JSON that will give you the sound the animal makes. And I want you to open an alert that contains the sound that the animal makes. Using a resource that responds with JSON and open an alert containing the sound that the animal makes. How's everyone feeling about this? Anonymous attendee says, but the console is not working in code spaces. Yeah, so I had that problem too. Let's see. So if the console is not working in code spaces, you can extend, if you're still using, if you're using code spaces, just add a form to your page, and then you will be able to put sounds into the database. So I hope that answers your question. Manon says, looks like a weekend exercise, but I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, I think this is gonna be a fun one. I think you can all do it though. It's definitely bigger than the last assignment, but let's face it, the last assignment was pretty tame, especially for anyone that's seen JavaScript before. But you can do this. You can definitely do this. So we have all the pieces, right? In exercise 1, we know how to create a model. That's obvious to everyone that's created a model so far. Exercise 2, we can create a page that lists all of them. That should be pretty straightforward too. And then exercise 3, this is where the hard part comes in, but you think you're just going to define a resource route, like a show endpoint for the animal. And then you're going to call that from the web page. And when it responds, it's going to respond with JSON that has the sound inside of the JSON payload. And then you will take that sound and you'll just pass it to alert. Always says sometimes the server doesn't work too. It won't just forward the ports. Yeah, this is beta software. They do the best they can. I think for the most part, it works pretty well. It definitely saves us it's been very good up until now, so it saves us some pain. And if you're committed to not having that pain, then what you can do is you can set up Ruby and Rails locally. And I will also push my changes because I know some people are using the changes. Okay, I'll sit around for a minute and answer questions people might have. Yeah, I think CodeSpace is still a very good compromise for what we're doing. Rajesh says, I think in Ruby, the order in which we write functions matters. By that, I mean I can write functions described below, but not in Ruby. I observed it doesn't make a difference in JavaScript. Is it possible to explain why? It shouldn't make a difference in Ruby either. So the only important thing, and this thing is important in JavaScript too, is that you call the method. If you're calling a method from outside of the function, that you have to call it after the function's defined, because you can't call something before it's defined. But if you're doing something like defining multiple methods, and for example, this John method were to call the time method, that's fine in both languages, fine in Ruby and in JavaScript. Olawason says, does fetch send the session to? So when you receive a request that's been set via fetch from the browser that's on the exact same domain and in the same browser session, you can access the session. So I think that answers your question. It doesn't send the session, but the fetch calls still send the cookies, which is what you need in order to receive the session on the Rails side. So I hope that answers your question. The answer is yes, you can still access session inside of a JSON call. Manon says, what will be the timeline we get to complete the project? I assume you're not talking about the homework, which is the timeline is it's on you to find whatever time works for you. If you're talking about the final project, I covered that a lot in the last episode, but the general idea is that it's going to be 2 to 3 weeks of time to complete the project. Yeah, this has been a pretty wild month. Even by the initial things that we were going to learn, it's a lot of content. We're going to learn JavaScript, Rails, Ruby, HTML. That's kind of the things that I said before everyone joined we were going to learn. But think about all of the ancillary things that we've learned. We learned about connecting to a database. We learned about CSS. Now we learned about JSON. We learned about just like a million other things that we had to learn along the way. Eric says, I can't believe it's been a month already. The time has been going so fast. Yeah, it has. And that's good. In the day-to-day, it might feel like it's going slow, and and that it feels like so much. But then when you look back, hopefully you're all seeing kind of the benefit of working like that, and that like you're capable of taking in a lot if you stick with it, which obviously everyone that's here has been doing. So, Eric, you're in university on top of the boot camp. That's good dedication. I like that. Any other questions? Any other I'll answer anything you want. And then obviously tomorrow is pretty much our last like intense class that we'll be going over details of programming. In the final one, we're more going to be kind of doing a wrap up on things, showing a little bit of how Heroku works, and going over the details of the final project. Always, and I'll cover that in 2 days. Rajesh, yes, you can message me about the progress bar doubt, or you can just Google about servo links in Rails, and that should provide you some details on how it works. Basically, the idea is that JavaScript is the thing reloading the page and changing the contents. But feel free to message me. Felipe says, will we have code spaces available until the final project is done? I will try to make sure that's the case. Although I don't fully know. So bear with me as I find out more details about that. But if we don't, then the people that are attempting to complete the final project, I will do my best to help you get Ruby installed on your computer. It might be worth spending some time if you have the time to. If you're on a Mac computer, it's pretty easy to install Ruby. Actually, it's already installed for you on the computer. So in the terminal, you already have Ruby. So that's a good place to start. I would just look up whatever operating system you're on. I would just look up something like setting up Ruby on Rails 6 in X, setting up Ruby on Rails 6 on Mac OS, setting up Ruby on Rails 6 on Windows. Johnny says, which version can I use? I'm not sure what you're asking, but if you're asking what version of Ruby, I think pretty much anything 2.7 and up is good. That's the most recent Ruby. But if you're going to install Ruby, you're going to get the most recent version. Same with Rails. When you do gem install Rails, which is how you'll install Rails on your computer, it by default is going to pull down the most recent version of Rails, whatever that is at the time. So if like 6.1.4 comes out next, then you'll have 6.1.4. Google is super helpful. And Ruel says, I thought it went till the 30th. Nah, we're done. The last day is the 25th, I think. But then like I'll still be communicating with you by email, and we'll still have 2 to 3 weeks of a final project. And like I've said, I'm thinking about doing another one of these. So who knows? Okay, cool. Well, thank you for your time. And what language is Google written? Most of the server-side components of Google, I believe, are written in Python. And a lot of like the intense parts of Google, like the parts that actually power the search engine, I would have to imagine are written in a language like C, for example, is probably what they're written in. Rubina says, I hope we can keep a hold of your videos. Yeah, I still have to figure out, I mean, they'll still be there, no matter, they're going to be there unlisted. I still have to figure out whether or not I'm going to publish them for other people. But yeah, they are actually an unlisted playlist already. I can send the link to the playlist, but they're already all sitting in a playlist. At the end of the course, on the last day, I'm planning to send out an email to you that'll contain a form that'll ask you questions for your opinion on things like, are you okay with us publishing the videos? Are you okay with, maybe do you have any feedback about the course? Are you okay with me talking about that feedback in maybe like a wrap up type post that I do? Because my hope with the whole class is to get it to the point where other people can repeat the same class, maybe for their local community. So I would love to be able to publish some of what we do, at least the write-up of what we do, so that people can see it and they can hopefully copy it. Okay. The playlist I will send right here, and hopefully someone can get it like into Slack or something, but I'll send it. Hold on. I do think the playlist is useful, but please, just a reminder, do not share this outside the class. And that's just because we don't know what we're doing with the videos yet. Ruel, it doesn't show the chat in the video, so your corny jokes are safe. But if I say your corny jokes out loud, then you're in the video. And yeah, I'm sure the jokes were great too. I've seen a lot of great jokes in this chat. All right, I will see you all tomorrow for the second to last class. Bye.